I want to start from a few words about the European Green Deal, just to give the context, and then we will look at how that translates into our policies, our legislation in terms of the financing instruments, and of course our programming, and we look at some lessons learned. The next slide, please. Very long route, but don't worry, I will not give you a lecture on the latest findings of the IPCC report, but I do think it's important that we go back to the basics and the science in our minds, and just three messages that I want to pass on and highlight from the report that the IPCC published last month, which I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. And the first is that we are not on track. We're not on track on meeting the 1.5 target, and certainly not even the 2-degree targets. And that means we need to step up action on climate change mitigation. If we are, we can reduce the magnitude and avoid the worst impacts of climate change, but we will still have impacts to which we will need to adapt. And I believe we already see that these impacts are becoming stronger, more frequent, and more complex to manage. And so it is of the utmost importance that we look at simultaneously addressing the mitigation and the adaptation challenges. There is hope. We have seen that the mitigation and adaptation actions can be effective in reducing emissions, but also reducing the magnitude of impacts and the risks around the impacts of climate change. However, the progress is very uneven across the different regions of the world. And of course, we are not there at the scale we need to be. So whereas we can still address the challenge and ripe the benefits of some of the opportunities that we have in terms of moving to a green economy pathway, we also have to really change drastically the way we do business in general. So next slide, please. I'm sure you're all very well familiar with the European Green Deal. Elizabeth, you rightly mentioned it at the beginning of the session as the framework which really sets and charts the way in which the European Union aims at addressing the global challenges of climate change, of course, but also biodiversity losses. The two are very much intertwined, and whereas I focus in my presentation on climate change, we also have a very similar approach to addressing biodiversity and environmental challenges. One of the things that I want to highlight when it comes to the European Green Deal is that it has proven very resilient. It has been launched just before a series of global crises that we have seen: COVID-19 pandemic, the unjustified invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And what we've seen is that despite the challenges and the pressure that these global changes have brought, the Green Deal has remained really the lifeline and the growth path that the European Union wants to continue to follow. It's actually the only answer that makes sense in the context of the current political context. Of course, we need to enhance the security of our energy system. We need to enhance the security of our global value chains and local value chains. And we can only achieve that by taking an integrated approach to the green transition. Climate policies are certainly at the center of the European Green Deal, but we're also looking at other sectors across the board: the taxonomy to incentivize private sector to come along, circular economy, targeting in particular small businesses, but also large enterprises, protection of forests, of nature, of biodiversity. All of this is in an integrated package of transformative policies that are really aiming at changing the way we do business, moving beyond the traditional silos approach. I'm sure you've heard that many times, but this is really the only way in which we can bring to bear all our policies and instruments we have. Of course, the Green Deal has a very strong international dimension. The European Union cannot achieve its global ambition alone, and we have a privileged relations, of course, with our immediate neighbors. The next slide, please. Just a couple of words of what it is that the European Union intends to do and is already doing at the international level. Of course, first and foremost, we need to get our act together at home. We need to lead by example. And there's a whole raft of legislations and, and acts that have translated our international commitment on climate and on biodiversity into legislations. The Fit for 55 package, to mention one and of the latest, but of course the many that are in the making, also around disclosure of activities by businesses, sustainable product initiatives, ensuring that our consumption doesn't lead to deforestation in third countries, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, so on and so forth. We are continuing to use our trade and diplomatic tools in two ways. First and foremost, with major economies. The European Union, I think, is around 9% of global emissions currently. It was quite clear that we have to get the major emitters on board, and they have to increase their ambition. So that's exactly what we try to do through our diplomatic tools. And of course, engaging also with other partners to make sure we can address better the challenges and opportunities that they face in the current context of economic growth and development. We're working on a third leg, which is setting standards for sustainable growth. And this is indeed around different aspects, from resilient infrastructure to critical infrastructure, to once again making sure that disclosure measures and legislations are up to scratch and that can be replicated outside the border of the EU. So just a couple of examples that I wanted to bring. As I mentioned, the partnership with our immediate neighbors is critical for us to succeed, and that's why we have a different engagement when it comes to how we deal with the Eastern partners, with the Southern neighbors, and of course with the accession countries in the Western Balkans and Turkey. Not only that, there are of course mutual benefits in moving together towards the green transition, but we also have specific actions that are highlighted in the European Green Deal, such as the Western Balkans Green Agenda, which we successfully launched together with the leaders of the region, but also climate change, energy and environment partnerships with the Eastern Partnership countries and southern neighborhoods. And we have a few bilateral and regional examples that I'm sure you're all aware of. So how does that translate into practice? On three volets, let me address first the legislative part, and then we will move on to the policy and the programming part. The next slide, please. Serge already mentioned the European Union commitment to dedicate at least 30% of our funding to climate change action. And this applies to the neighborhood and development international cooperation instrument. I hope it's NDICI in short, Global Europe. That's an alternative. You'll heard it, or NDC. We have an endless discussion. Is it NDC? Is it NDICI? Is it? Anyway, I will call it NDICI, so bear with me. We have enshrined in our legislation for the NDICI, which is the financial instruments we have at our disposals to cooperate with Eastern Partnership countries, these principles that you have heard throughout the morning. So first and foremost, the NDICI instrument has to dedicate at least 30% of its overall envelope to climate change action. So that's a big step compared to the previous MFF, and it's really quite ambitious. The second principle, which is enshrined in our NDICI regulation, is the mainstreaming principle. So we have to follow and contribute to the objectives of the European Green Deal, also by mainstreaming climate action and, of course, environment and biodiversity in all our cooperation and union policies. And the third principle, which is at least as important, is the principle of doing no harm. Even if we have actions that are not directly contributing to climate change, they have at least to not harm our climate change objectives, our biodiversity objectives, and our environmental objectives. And we will see later on that we are actually trying to move from do no harm to do good. It isn't always easy, but that's one of the things that we are trying to work on. The next slide, please. Just to put things a little bit into context on this 30% target, this is what we have in our legislation. So the NDICI regulation sets the 30% target. We also have a political commitment, which is additional. Our president, in her State of the Union address 2 years ago, committed to an additional 4 billion of international climate change finance. And this effectively means that we have to achieve at least a 35% target globally on NDICI. And I do not have the figures with me, but when it comes to the Eastern Partnership, it also means a much higher target than 35% because a big part of the envelope that we have dedicated to our neighborhood is actually already taken by other priorities. So how can we actually achieve that? That's the key challenge. The next slide, please. We do that first. Oh, sorry. I'm not used to animations. Thank you. So how do we do that? First, policy framework. So we must ensure that our overarching policy priorities in engaging with the neighbors and the Western Balkans duly take into account and promote this approach. So what we have for the three regions, and including the Eastern Partnership, is an economic and investment plan that sets out key priorities, areas of intervention, specific investments that we have identified together with our partners that can be transformative and really take us on the green transition jointly. Overall, for the Eastern Partnership, the resilience is really at the core, and the focus is very much on the twin green and digital transition. And I'm sure that through the EU for Climate project, you have been exploring quite a few of the other elements that we are promoting in the region, and you're helping us actually to advance on these objectives very much. Two things that are worth mentioning: Global Gateway. You probably have heard of the Global Gateway. This is the offer of the European Union to our partners in terms of sustainable and resilient connectivity on infrastructure, of course, but also on value chain, also on the regulatory environment. So this is really how do we make our engagement with partners sustainable in the future and working for us and for our partners at the same time. The economic and investment plans help us implement the principles of the Global Gateway and support the green transition and the twin digital transition in our partner countries, including in the Eastern Partnership. I cannot, of course, fail to mention the fact that the situation in the Eastern Partnership countries has changed dramatically with the war of aggression against Ukraine, but we do believe that the overall policy frameworks remain valid. Of course, we need in the immediate term to support partners in facing the energy but also material challenges that we have as a consequence of the war of aggression, but paving the way for mid to long term transition and a growth path that is different remains really valid, and that is what is enshrined in the economic and investment plan for the region. So the last, we have the policy framework, we have the legislation, we have the policy framework, and how do we translate that into our programming, into our daily engagement with partners and in our projects and programs? I believe that we have actually very well captured in our frameworks of cooperation, whether regional or bilateral, the climate change priorities. And in fact, in a couple of the countries, and in particular Armenia and Azerbaijan, we have in what governs our relationship, this multi-annual programming framework, a very strong prominence of climate change action. Where perhaps we are still a bit weak is on the adaptation side. The focus remains very much on mitigation, and I've heard from some of you earlier on that the adaptation challenges are also huge and that you are already striving to take steps also with the help of the EU for Climate project, and that's very good. So we rely on you to help us make sure that adaptation becomes more of a priority in what we do. Disaster risk reduction is also perhaps less given less attention in our cooperation than perhaps it deserves. As we've heard, investing in renewable energy and energy efficiency is more straightforward. Perhaps that's why we see this. We also have, of course, regional cooperation, and I think the EU for Climate is a very good example of how that can work in practice. And it's also an example, by the way, that we are taking to our other regions so that we can replicate it with the necessary adaptation. So that's I think, very important to stress. Next slide, please. So how do we do more? And that's where we're trying, and we're really looking for your help to take with us the action to the next level. So the starting point of our cooperation across the board should really be on aligning everything that we do with the Paris Agreement. What does that mean? It means that we do need to continue to have dedicated climate action, but increasingly we will have to make sure that all the actions we have jointly in all the sectors are actually tailored to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy efficiency, and enhancing resilience. The easy win, it's certainly what we do to support the development of the private sector. Our engagement on SMEs and on larger corporation has to be around circular economy, has to be around improving efficiency of production, has to be around breaking this link between GDP and emissions that some of you mentioned earlier on. We need to focus more and more on transformational areas. We have a lot of successes in the energy sector, and perhaps we'll hear a few more later in the afternoon from Peter of the energy community. But we do need to invest more in other sectors. So for instance, we have many untapped opportunities in agriculture. Believe it or not, agriculture intuitively is an easy sector to work with when you want to achieve the double objective of sustainable food security, rural development, and climate change mitigation and adaptation. Yet we are not there yet. The focus is very much often on standards, on developing businesses without an eye to the long term. And we need you to help us make sure that we have this long-term perspective in everything that we do in sectors that are less used, but where there's a huge potential. I mentioned, of course, agriculture, land use, forestry, circular economy, working with SMEs. These are all very critical sectors where we must step up action. And so anything that you can also do in the context of the EU for Climate to help us identify opportunities in these less explored sectors would be very much welcome. We need to invest more in nature-based solutions. Why? Because they bring multiple benefits. And of course, this is not a silver bullet. They will not be the right solution everywhere. And yet, there are many more opportunities that we could exploit, achieving biodiversity targets at the same time as resilience and mitigation targets. And often in a cheaper way and more sustainable than grey infrastructure. Or combining grey and nature-based solution is often very cost-effective. And we have many good examples in Europe that we would be happy to share and explore. And finally, of course, we must look for synergies. And I think this sums up a bit what I've been saying. I think we need to be very conscious that, for instance, between biodiversity activities and climate change activities, there's a huge synergies potential that we must exploit. And that's taking us from what I call mainstream to what I call mainstreaming 2.0 or greening. This is really where we need to jointly go. The next slide, please. I'm getting there, I promise. We talked a lot about the private sector, in particular with Serge's intervention, and that's the next slide, please. Okay, great. Sorry. We've talked about how we can use our public finances and how you can help us use them better for the climate change objectives. But what about the private sector? I think we've heard before, and we're all very aware of the fact that public finances alone will in no way be anywhere near able to cover the scale of the financing that we need for this transformation. So how do we use public finance to mobilize private sector investments? And I think that's what we need to do jointly. Again, we have the European Fund for Sustainable Development Plus instrument, which is, traditionally, if I so may say, blending and grants projects, but also a new open access guarantee scheme. Can we identify with private sector and IFIs transformative projects that we can promote in our countries? And that's the only way in which we can really bring scale. And we can do that only by having upstream strategic planning and strategic discussions with some of the key actors, the banks as intermediaries. Your local banks, of course, who also work very much with international financing institutions, and then with the private sector or associations of private sector to find and identify bankable projects and facilitate this connection where it is missing. And of course, I think we have talked a little bit about environmental and social safeguards and standards earlier on. I think there is a whole draft of legislation that is coming on board or has just been released that hopefully will help us define what are good standards. But we also need to make sure that locally we implement thoroughly the environmental impact assessment legislation, the strategic environmental assessment legislations, which have been already enhanced with a climate change perspective. So I think, it's a joint responsibility and we all need to work on that. We are, of course, ready to help with assistance, but this is a commitment that countries will have to take or uphold. Next slide, please. So we have again, where are the animations? I don't know. Next slide. Okay, fantastic. So we have developed a few toolboxes, let's say, that hopefully can also be helpful to you. We use them very much internally in the European Commission, but they are available to all of our partners. And these include an environment and climate change integration guidelines. These are currently under revision to better reflect the new instrument architecture of instruments, the NDICI, but also the EFSD Plus, and how we actually address and what are the entry points for the various instruments we have. But we also have what I find extremely useful quick tips. And these are sectoral notes, from education to digital to agriculture on how in practice we can actually achieve more than one objective at a time. So how do we concretely mainstream climate change and biodiversity into our cooperation and into our development strategy? So I would invite you to look up at these instruments. I can share the links with you later on if you don't have it, because these are really practical ways in which we can achieve impact. So let me conclude with the next slide. Good, no animations here. So just to recap a bit, we have ambitious spending targets in our legislation. We have an additional political commitment of our president, to which we're all working towards. But achieving this requires not only a qualitative but also quantitative shift in the way we do business. It is not anymore about mainstreaming, it's about greening. It's really about ensuring that everything we do is aligned to the objectives of the Paris Agreement and the CBD, the Convention on Biodiversity. We must find ways of moving beyond do no harm. And what does that entail? It entails looking for opportunities where, for an additional, perhaps small effort in, in investing in an agriculture project, we can promote biodiversity. We can achieve, again, the opportunities and harness them much more than by simply taking a sectoral perspective. The quick tip guides are a useful instrument to do so, but clearly we have to also shift the way we program, the way we interact, and the way we have policy dialogues. And I know you will also face challenges back home, but you also have an opportunity to discuss with the line DGs and the other policy DGs back home about what are the opportunities of working together and harnessing some of these synergies. We need to focus more on transformative areas. We often do what my head of unit calls plain vanilla, things that we know work, which we need to do, but we also need to transform. And so we need to find ways of exploring and testing what can be actions that can actually bring about quick transformation that then we can scale out as fast as we can. The new financing instruments we have at our disposal, including the open access guarantee, can help us do that with the private sector, but we need good ideas. So I'll leave you with these good ideas, call for giving us good ideas on how we can actually do that, and then we can see how it can happen. Last, policy reforms, enabling environment, public and private finance working together, these remain the underlying conditions that are necessary for anything really, whether it is a growth that doesn't leave anybody behind or a growth that is green or simply an economic growth, which is not the path that we want to pursue. Irrespective of that, we need to have a good enabling environment. And that's where policy dialogue and working together around some of the instruments we have, including, of course, the energy community for those of you who are contracting parties, but also the association agreements, really will help us to set the stage right for then scaling out these transformative actions that we all want to identify. So with this, I am concluded. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any questions or further exchanges.